This time we're going to talk about file management, how to reset your scene, and how to open your files. So let's just start by clicking at the upper left corner at the top menu. We've got File. Here you've got a lot of options: New, Reset, Open, Open Recent, Save, Save As. First thing we're going to do is open a new scene. As you can see, there's a file in Max format. That's a format native to 3ds Max. Other applications may have problems opening this kind of files. Now let's just click on Open, and now the scene is loaded. As you can see, this is a very basic scene with just a box and a teapot. Now if I add any kind of changes, what can I do is click on File, Save, and this is automatically going to save my file. If I want to rename this file, I can save this file as. This is going to be handy if you're going to create some kind of backups at some point, or just another version of your file. So now let's add increment number 01. As you can see, now this name changed near the file. It means that we're actually working on file 01. If you click on Save Copy As, that means that you will be able to save your file as an independent copy, and as you can see, it's going to have a new increment number without you having to type it in. So we can just save it, and as you can see, we are still working on the previous file, file 01. That's very important in this case, because if you're going to create another override for this next scene, you may want to remember that. Now, if we have our scene and we pretty much are done, we want to move on to another project, you can either start 3ds Max all over again, or you can click on Reset. This is going to set your 3ds Max into initial state, and you can now start working on any kind of work you like. You also have an option to start a new work or new file by clicking File, New, New All. This is pretty much going to refresh everything the same way as Reset would. What you can also do is click on New from Template. This is going to allow you to start your work with independent layers or some kind of render settings that you already have previously created. This is a very handy thing for interiors, for pack shots, but not necessarily right now. Let's move on to something that is going to be more interesting to you. Alt W to enlarge this viewport. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the main panel on the right side. The first thing that we need to know about this panel is that here we've got those buttons: Create, Modify, Hierarchy, and Utilities. Those two are not going to be really used, so we don't have to talk about them. Now, in Creation panel, if you click on any kind of object, you can start creating this pretty much primitive object. Let's click and hold your left mouse button. When you let go of your left mouse button, you're going to get into the second stage of object creation. Most of the objects in 3ds Max are going to have 2 or even 3 stages of creation. So remember, don't just click randomly, try to focus on what you're doing. Again, if you hold Control and start creating any kind of object like a box, it's going to start from the middle and it's going to create a perfect square as a base. It is not possible to do the same with height. You will have to adjust it manually. And to do it, all you need to do is select the already created box, go to Modify panel. So in this parameters, you can see that we've got length, width, and height. Those are going to be pretty much the same for most of the objects, but all of them are going to have some kind of unique properties. So you won't see exactly the same menus for a cylinder as you would with a box. Now we can add a lot of extras like length segments in here, so you can pretty much do it when you need it. Now, what we're also going to explore is something called AutoGrid. AutoGrid is going to be one of the creation panel, let's call it tricks. If you start creating any kind of object, let's say a cylinder, and turn on the auto grid, you will be able to create objects on one another. This is going to be extremely helpful when creating interiors, because this is exactly how you can add details to your walls, tables, etc. Now, let's continue and talk a little bit about viewport navigation, because so far we did create a few objects, but how can we actually look around them? Well, as you already know, we've got those options here. Alt W to go back to our previous viewport setup. Now, what I'm going to explore with you is this zoom option. Zoom option is pretty much going to work the same way as your middle mouse button would. So if you scroll in and scroll out, you're going to zoom in and zoom out. But if you want to have a little bit more manual control, you can pretty much do it with left mouse button. This is going to be pretty much the same as your scroll, but scroll has this tendency to jump, while zoom is going to be a little bit smoother. Now, the next thing we got on our list is zoom all. This is going to work on all of your viewports at the same time. Pretty handy when modeling from blueprints and you just want to keep your scale. Here we've got zoom on extends. This is pretty much going to zoom in on all the objects in your scene or selected object. So if we don't have any objects selected, it's going to pretty much cover all of your scene in your viewport. Next to it, we've got zoom extend on all. This is going to work exactly the same way as zoom all would. So it's just going to align your viewport to all those objects in your scene. Very handy when modeling, so remember this option. Here we've got field of view option. Field of view is going to be your focal length. So let's just try to work with this lens for a second. And to do that, I'm going to press R, scale this object into oblivion, so we can actually have some kind of object that is going to resemble house. Now, as you can see, by pressing F3, I'm toggling the wireframe mode on and off. But what I really need is to zoom in on this cylinder. Now, we are inside of this box, so we're going to try to work with it. Now, as you can see, again, we don't really have much to work with, and we cannot really see anything else than the walls. So this is when your field of view is going to be very handy. We can zoom out this way by changing our field of view. So right now we have pretty wide angle, and as you can see, we cover this whole room at the same time. You can also zoom in this way, which is going to give you this more filmic look. Most of the cases you want to keep your viewport as wide as you need, because in this case it's just going to be easier to navigate in your scene. Remember that when you go with very wide angle and pretty much zoom in on all the objects in your scene, you will get this dynamic type of look. This can be very distracting, so I would say that you should not really go for too wide angles, especially for objects that are small. Otherwise, you will have a little bit of problems. If by some mistake you will have this happen to you, all you need to do is press any kind of shortcut for any kind of other viewport. In this case, we've got perspective. If we jump to orthographic or top, we can now press P and we have restarted our field of view. Next to field of view, we have our walkthrough mode. To show you how walkthrough mode works, I'm going to press F3 to toggle wireframe for a second, select a cylinder inside of our box, zoom in on it by pressing Z, and I'm going to press my upper arrow. This is automatically going to activate our walkthrough mode. As you can see, I'm now moving around quite freely, just as I would in a video game. In here, you can see that if you press your left mouse button, you can pick other options. So there's also a zoom, there's a different type of panning around, And of course, we've got orbit modes. Most of them are really not that useful, but as it goes for orbit, this is going to be very helpful because you can manually select what kind of rotation you want to achieve. Very handy when looking for nice angles with your camera. Again, if we press left Alt, we can pretty much do the same, but you are not going to have this option to move freely around in one direction. This is very nice for some effects, but in most of the cases, it's not going to be really that helpful. Now, we pretty much have covered most of our viewport options, but we still haven't really configured it right. I think we've made a little bit of mess in this scene, so let's just hide it. If you want to hide objects, what you can do is either select it, right click on it and hide selection, or you can select the object that you can keep and right click, hide unselected. Now, if you want to unhide those objects, you can just right click and unhide all. It is also going to work on any kind of object that you don't have selected. At this moment, I don't have anything in my selection, and if I hide selection, nothing happens. If I hide unselected, everything is hidden. So let's just keep one of those objects right now and talk a little bit about copying objects. In the previous video, I told you that we're going to talk a little bit about copy, instance, and reference. And I think that this is the right moment to do that. To copy your object, all you need to do is press left shift and manipulate it. It can be either scaling, rotating, or movement at any direction. You can set the number of copies that are going to be created. So if we go for 5, you're going to end up with 6 cylinders. But at this moment, we only need 1 copy. So again, left shift, copy, and the number is now reset. There are many options in here like copy, instance, and reference. So right now we're going to go for copy. Here we're going to create an instance. And the next thing we're going to create is a reference. All those objects are pretty much the same, but what happens if we start manipulating one of them? Manipulation like movement, rotation, and scaling is not going to have effect either on instance or reference, but more about it in a second. So I'm going to quickly add a turbo smooth modifier, and as you can see now this object is a little bit different. If I add turbo smooth to the copy, as you can see all of those changed. What happened here is that this is an independent copy. So we actually don't call this a copy, we call this a clone. So this object is the original, this is the clone of the original, this is the instance of the original, and this is the reference. What's the difference between copy and instance? In copy, you get an independent clone that you can manipulate, change, and edit to your will. Instance is going to work the same way as the original. So if you change something in the original, the copies, and I mean the instances, are also going to be changed. If we have the original, instance, and reference, there's a difference between the 3 of them. First, if we start working on our reference object, it's not going to have any kind of effect on the previous object. Now, if I select our instance, which is a copy of this object, you will see that any change I make is also going to be translated to all of those objects. This is very handy when modeling very complicated objects and you just want to focus on some kind of detail and you want to see the end result. Or you just want to create a multiple variations of one object. That's when the reference is going to be very handy. But more about it later when we will be actually working with those objects. Now, you need to remember that instances are also going to be affected by modifiers. So if, for instance, we create a box, create an instance and add a modifier on top of it, it is going to have an effect on both of them. So it doesn't matter if you touch the original or the instance, both of them are going to change. This link is going to be broken as soon as you collapse this object. So you can right click, make unique, collapse to, or collapse all. If I collapse all, we're going to get this collapse warning. Yes, I want to collapse, and this is now changed to editable mesh. We don't really use editable mesh, we use editable poly. To convert your object to editable poly, all you need to do is right click on the object. So this quad menu is going to appear, and we go to the right hand side, the bottom of it, and here we've got editable poly. Now this object allows us to manipulate all the elements of it. And I think this is the best moment to actually explore what our objects are made of. First of all, we've got first sub-object level called vertex. Vertex is a point in space which can be connected with another point with edge. So this is edge. Edge is going to connect one or more pairs of vertices. If you create multiple edges that connects to one another, you will create something that is called a polygon. Polygons can have a lot of shapes. For instance, it could be a triangle. So this is the most primitive 3D object you can create. 3 vertices, 3 edges, 1 polygon. This polygon is a triangle. That's why we call it a trees. If you, for instance, are going to work on this kind of object, this is 2 triangles. Now, if we delete this line in the middle, you will see that now we're working on quad. So this is a polygon made out of 4 vertices. Your polygons can have more than just a few vertices, and those can be pretty, well, nasty, because as soon as you get a lot of them, you will have something called n-gon. Anything that has more than 5, any polygon that has more than 5 vertices is called n-gon. You may call it a pentagon if it's going to be a perfect shape, but in this case we do call it an n-gon. If we connect those excess vertices, you can see that what we get is actually 2 quads. Quads don't have to have a perfect shape. All it matters is that you work with 4 vertices. We are going to try to model our objects in quads, as this is the industry standard and it's going to be very helpful in the future. What you also noticed is that I freely created and deleted a lot of those vertices. So let's, for instance, create a few extra lines. I'm going to select those 2 opposite edges, add this few connections, and we're going to explore a difference between remove, delete, and pretty much split. Now, what I'm going to do is press Ctrl and Backspace. In this case, what we're going to get is a very clean deletion of this edge. So Ctrl, Backspace, and we don't have any kind of leftovers. If I just press Backspace, you are still going to be left with the same n-gon, but this edge no longer appears. So this is the inferior method to Control Backspace, because this actually cleans your mesh a little bit better. There's also an option to select an edge and simply press Delete. This is going to be the most destructive, but as you can see, it's also going to be very effective. So now you know the difference between delete, backspace, and control backspace. I quickly went back to our previous setup and we're now going to work a little bit with pivots. To access the pivot menu, we're going to first click on hierarchy, affect pivot only, and as you can see now the gizmo looks a little bit different. This could be called your object's gravity center or pretty much its rotation point. Now, if we try to rotate this object, as you can see, it pretty much rotates around itself. But if we try to affect pivot only, move it outside of this object and apply this change, if we go to our rotation, you will see that now we're actually moving with a gizmo outside of this object. This is going to be very handy when you will be creating some different type of objects, clocks, or just walls. Right now, this is looking quite silly, but as you can see, it's going to be useful at some point because it allows us to quickly and effortlessly create some kind of shapes that otherwise would be impossible or just would take a lot of time to create. Now, the pivot is also going to be very helpful when working with groups because you may not really want to change your object's pivot because it's going to be related to its position or any kind of property. Now, if you want to avoid that, what you can do is create a group. But to actually work with groups, we're going to copy our teapot a few times and actually explore what kind of options we have with groups. First of all, we can select multiple objects, group them, name the group. By default, it's going to be named group 001 and the number is going to increase incrementally depending on how many groups you already have in your scene. So you can always change this name here as you would with all the objects. So let's just type in teapot. This is pretty much a teapot. Now we've got this group's name. So let's go back to group's name as it was by default, group 001. Now, if we select this group, you can affect the pivot of the group only. So now if we go back to our objects separately, you will be able to still manipulate them using the same pivot. Another option that we can also explore is grouping multiple groups together. So again, we've got this group that is inside of a group, but what if I actually want to open it or detach an object from a group? First of all, you can click on group, open, and it's going to only open the first level of the group. So you can see that the previous group is still here. Now, if we close this group, and you want to go to the deepest level of all of those groups inside, you can open recursively. Now, all of those groups are open and you can access all the individual objects at the same time. Now, you can select one of the objects and detach it from group, and this is pretty much going to work instantaneously, where you can see that now this object is alone and it's no longer part of a group. So this is going to be a very handy tool to when you will be working with your interiors. So again, please remember this option. Now we already know quite a lot about 3ds Max, so why not try to explore this modify panel a little bit more. Let's just put our object closer to 0 point. As you can see now it's pretty much almost at 0, but only with its pivot. And how did I type in those zeros? You can select those brackets here and right click on any value that you already have. By right clicking on it, you're going to instantly move it to its lowest nominal. So in this case, it's 0. So our object pivot is actually on 0, 0, 0 right now. But let's explore a little bit of our modify panel. As you can see, we've got a lot of options. So first of all, we've got modifiers. Remember when I told you that 3ds Max can be a little bit intimidating? So this is one of those moments where you look at this list and you have no idea what this is. Honestly, most of those modifiers are going to be very helpful in your professional work, but we're going to focus solely on 10 of them because those are going to be the base of our work. Most of the time, you won't use 90% of those modifiers that you can see, but we're definitely going to use some of them, like Turbo Smooth, that allows you to smoothen out your objects without any effort. As you can see now, before this object was quite stiff, as well a primitive object would be, and now we have a really nicely smoothed out mesh. So this is going to be one of those modifiers that we will be using from time to time. Again, we've got a lot different modifiers like FFD 4x4. This is a extremely useful modifier because it is going to allow you to freely modify your objects by grabbing all of those elements inside. Most of the modifiers that you will find in 3ds Max are going to have some kind of menus and dialogues in here. Turbo Smooth has only iteration options, and those options that are going to change the display type. But FFD is actually going to also have sub-object levels. What are sub-object levels? This is pretty much an extra option, extra menu that you have only in modifiers and some types of objects, like objects that are editable poly. Now, this is our sub-object level 1, sub-object level 2, and a sub-object level 3. You can start controlling those points by pressing 1, and this is going to automatically move you to our sub-object level 1. Now, if you choose to manipulate this object, you can just move it around, and this is how you can change this object, stretch it, or just pretty much give it a new face. But in this case, we're not going to save it because this is looking really bad. So let's just end here. Thank you very much for your attention and see you in another lesson soon.